Silas Farabee was on his feet before the attorney had finished reading, his chair scraping back across the boards, his finger pointed at the young woman by the window. "That is robbery," he said. "Plain robbery, dressed in law." Mr. Josiah Crump, attorney of Maidstone, lowered the paper and looked at him over his spectacles with the patience of a man who had buried 40 years of other people's tempers in his deed boxes. "It is your uncle's will, Mr. Farabee," he said. "Signed, witnessed, and sound. Sit down or stand, but it will read the same either way." The young woman by the window did not move. Her name was Honora Swan. She was 24, and she had come to that office in her aunt's mended pelisse, expecting nothing but a kind word left to her from a dead friend. Before 2 more winters had passed, the people in that room, and half the parish besides, would stand in the snow outside her gate with silver in their hands, waiting their turn for what grew behind her glass. Not one of them knew it yet. She knew it least of all. Mr. Crump took up the paper again and read the clause a second time, slowly, because the room had not believed it the first time. "To Miss Honora Swan, daughter of my late friend Lieutenant Nathaniel Swan, surgeon of His Majesty's Navy, I give and devise my freehold acre at Wickmere, with the orangery and pinery standing thereon, the stove trenches, the sheds, the tools, all stock growing under glass or lying in the tan, and my trench book, to hold to her and her heirs forever, that she may finish what we began. To my nephew Silas Farabee I give £50, which is more than he ever gave me an hour of." The attorney had the grace not to look up while he read that last part. Silas looked as if he had been struck across the face with a wet glove. £50, he said. £50, and a stranger's daughter takes the land." "She is no stranger," said the vicar, Mr. Harryard, from his corner, mildly. "She grew up in those glass houses. Half the parish saw it. She held the pots while Amos grafted." "She was a child underfoot," said Silas. "Children underfoot do not inherit acres." Mrs. Eugenia Pratt, the young woman's aunt, sat very straight in the second-best chair and stared at her niece as though she had done something indecent in church. "Honora," she said at last, in the carriage voice she used when strangers could hear, "you will of course decline. One does not accept ground from a gardener. It makes a spectacle." Mr. Crump coughed. "Madam," he said, with respect, "the ground was Mr. Farabee's to give. Freehold, bought and paid for. And the will is proved good, or will be, before the month is out. Whether the young lady makes a spectacle of it is her own affair." Honora heard all of this from a distance, the words arriving late, like sound across water. She was looking at the little iron key that Mr. Crump had set on the desk when he began, a stove key, black with 50 years of coal smoke, worn bright along one edge where a thumb had ridden it, morning and evening, through every frost of a long life. She knew whose thumb. She picked it up before her aunt could speak again, and it was warm from the sun on the desk, and that undid her more than the reading had. "Well," said Silas Farabee, gathering his hat, "we shall see what a court says to wills written for pretty faces." He said it loudly, to the room, but he looked at her while he said it, and Honora looked back at him and did not blink, because her father had taught her long ago that you do not look away from weather, you take its measure. Silas broke first. He went out, and his boots argued with the stairs all the way down. Amos Farabee had been head gardener at Wickmere Hall for 51 years. He had come to it a boy of 14 under the old master's father, and he had stayed through 2 squires, one war with the American colonies and another with the French, and the slow ruin of the family that employed him. In his great years the Hall's fruit had gone up to London twice a week in straw, and men had ridden 30 miles to see his pines. which is what he and every gardener of his day called a pineapple, a pine plant, a pine, the fruit of 2 years' fire and patience. King's gardeners had written to him. He had answered in a round, careful hand, always with a measurement in it, because opinion without measurement was gossip. He never in his life earned above £60 in a year, and he died worth an acre, a glass house the length of 11 bedsteads laid end to end, and, though nobody yet understood it, a book worth more than both. Honora's father had been his friend. Nathaniel Swan was a Kentish surgeon's son, who went to sea for the pay and stayed for the world, and he sent home to Amos, from every port a ship could touch, packets of seed folded in oiled paper, orange pips from Lisbon, melon seed from Malta, a cone from the Cape that never came to anything, and once, wrapped in lint inside a tea canister, the crown of a pineapple from a Kingston market with a letter that said, "See what you can make of her. She was the best of 40. Amos made a great deal of her. When the Arrow sloop went down off Ushant in the year 1806 with all hands, Amos Ferriby walked the 2 miles from the Hall Gardens to Mrs. Pratt's house in Wickmere village, stood in the passage with his hat in his 2 hands, and told the 14-year-old girl himself, before the newspaper could. Then he said, "Come up to the Glass on Saturday. Bring an apron. Grief needs work to eat, or it eats you." She went. She went every Saturday for 8 years. Her aunt permitted it because it cost nothing and removed her, and the parish grew used to the sight of the surgeon's orphan on the fruit wall ladders. And Lady Ottoline Farrow, who governed the neighborhood's opinions from her drawing room at Pellingcourt, pronounced it a pity, which from her was a sentence. The hall itself failed by inches all that while. The last squire, Mr. Everard Locksley, outlived his money, then his sons, then his interest in anything but port wine and the past. The gardens were let go, one man at a time, until only Amos remained, unpaid the last 3 years, keeping one house of glass alive out of his own savings, while the rest of that bright quarter-mile went dark, pane by pane, like a town seen from a departing ship. When Everard Locksley died, 2 years before this story begins, the estate was shut up and left to lawyers, and the heir, a great-nephew nobody in the parish had ever seen, remained wherever great-nephews are kept, and the frost got into the empty vineries, and still the one house at the south end showed a thread of smoke on winter mornings, because Amos Ferriby did not know how to let a living thing die for lack of trouble taken. He died in the first week of March, in the year 1816, in the potting shed, sitting down with his boots on, aged 85. Caleb Nutley, the odd job man, found him and said he looked like a man listening to something a long way off and in no hurry about it. The frost that night was the hardest of the winter, and the stove fires were made up and banked before he sat down, which told the whole story to anyone who knew him. And Honora knew him. She walked out to the acre the day after the reading, alone, against her aunt's flat instruction. In April, in a wind with sleet in its pockets. The orangery stood apart from the hall's walled gardens, on its own square of ground behind its own brick wall, which was the fact everyone had forgotten, and one man had died remembering. From the lane it looked like what the parish said it was, a ruin, a folly, the glass beggar's fortune. A quarter of the roof panes were gone or cracked, patched with boards and painted canvas. The great south lights were gray with years. One chimney of the stove shed had shed its top courses into the path. Elder had got in along the north wall, and a blackbird went off like an alarm when she worked the key, and the lock turned as sweetly as a watch, because it had been oiled within the month by a dead man for her. Inside, the cold came at her first, and then, underneath it, the thing that made her stand still in the doorway with her hand at her mouth. Warmth. Low. Animal. Breathing warmth, rising off the long brick pit that ran down the spine of the house like a raised grave. A trench the length of 9 paces packed with tanner's bark. And out of that dark bed, in ranks, in fat clay pots sunk to their shoulders, the pines. 32 pine plants in every age of life, sword-leaved, blue-green, savage and thriving. Suckers no bigger than her fist, 2-year plants broad as cartwheels. And at the south end, in the deepest heat, 5 crowned fruit swelling on their stalks, each one the color of a green coin and the size of her 2 fists, each one worth, in a London December, more than a footman earned in a quarter. Beyond the pit, ranged down the paved walk under the good glass, stood the orange trees in their white tubs, 12 of them, wrapped at the root with straw, leaves dark and clean, 3 showing fruit. Vine rods lay along the back wall like sleeping snakes, pruned to 2 eyes, tied with fresh bast. He had kept it all alive. Alone, unpaid, past 80, in the worst winters anyone could remember, the old man had walked out from his cottage twice a day, every day, and fed the fires and turned the bark and wrapped and watered and waited and told nobody. Because the parish had decided years ago that the glass was dead, and Amos Farabee had let the parish keep its opinion the way you let sheep keep a field you have no present use for. She found the trench book that same hour, because his letter told her where it would be, and the letter was on the potting bench, weighted with a pruning knife she had known since she was 14, and it was addressed, in the round, careful hand to Norrie, when they have all told you to sell. She read it standing, in the cold, with the smell of bark and oranges around her, and it said what he had never once said aloud in 8 years of Saturdays. That the acre was his, freehold, got lawfully from old Mr. Locksley's father in the year 1769, and never any man's since but his, whatever any steward might say. That the trench book lay in the iron box in the 3rd flue of the great stove, where the damp could not get it, and that everything was in the book. The fires, the bark, the sowings, the sums, 50 years of mornings, and she was to read it before she believed anyone about anything. That Peake and Son, nurserymen of Hackney, were honest, and held what was his on account, and would deal fairly with her if she wrote plainly. That she should mind the 9th course. And then, at the last, above his signature, a line that she folded away from her own eyes quickly, because sleet or no sleet there was work wanted doing before dark, and he had taught her that too. The iron box was where the letter said, hot to the touch on its underside, and the book inside was the size of a church Bible and heavier, bound in calf gone black, 5 decades of pages ruled in his own hand. She opened it at random and read, 3rd February 1791, hard frost, pit at 62 degrees, turned the bark 1 foot deep, bottom heat slow to rise. Note: oak leaves half and half with the dung answers better than dung alone in a long frost. Cheaper, too. She turned 20 years in one movement of her thumb and read, 9th June, 1809, Norrie sowed the Malta melons alone this day. Her drills straighter than Caleb's, said nothing. She works better unpraised. Like her father. She shut the book because the light was going, and not only because the light was going, there was a step on the path outside, a man's step, unhurried, and then a shape against the gray glass of the door. A thick-set man in a good drab coat with a face like a ledger kept in a bad year, who did not remove his hat, and who looked past her down the warm ranks of the pit with the quick counting eyes of his trade before he looked at her at all. "Miss Swan," he said. "My name is Dodd, Walter Dodd." Steward to Mr. Locksley that is now master of Witchmere Hall, who arrives Thursday se'nnight. I am come for the keys. Honora put the trench book under her arm before she answered, and felt the heat of the stove still in its covers. Like something alive she had been handed and told not to drop. The keys, she said, are mine, Mr. Dodd, by Amos Faraby's will. This house and this acre are mine. Mr. Dodd smiled the way men smile at weather they intend to outlast, and looked up at the broken lights, and then down the long pit where 5 green fruits sat ripening in their nest of fire, worth more than he supposed and less than he feared. And he said, We shall see, miss, what is yours, when Mr. Locksley's lawyers have read what gardeners sign. Until then I should not go selling anything, nor moving anything, nor burning good coals in a dead man's stove. He touched his hat then, the single mockery he permitted himself, and went, and his step died away down the lane. And the blackbird came back to the elder and began to sing as if nothing in the world were contested. Honora stood a long time in the failing light between the orange trees and the fire. Then she took off her gloves, folded them into her pocket, went down on one knee at the stokehole door, and did the first thing, which was what he had trained into her when she was 14 and hollow with grief and good for nothing else. She made up the fire. Her aunt's parlor was small, clean, and armed. Mrs. Eugenia Pratt had been the wife of a corn factor, and widowhood had reduced her income without reducing her opinions, and she had spent the 2 days since the reading polishing an argument the way other women polish plate. She deployed it over the teapot on the 3rd evening, with the curtains drawn against the neighbor's interest. You will sell, she said. Mr. Silas Faraby has made an offer which, considering his ill usage, is handsome. £12 for the lead, the glass, and the iron, he to carry it away at his own cost. The trees will fetch something from the innkeepers. The land goes back to the hall for what it will bring. And there is an end, and you may put £50 by and be grateful, and nobody need speak of it again. £12, said Honora. Her aunt heard the tone and chose to misread it. It is more than fair, she said, for a ruin. Aunt, said Honora, the 5 fruit ripening in that ruin this evening will bring £25 by themselves, in London, before August. Her aunt set down the teapot with a click that in a larger woman would have been a shout. A lady, she said, does not sell pineapples. A lady, it appeared, might sew shirts at a shilling apiece in a cold parlor, might teach other women's daughters their scales, might live thin and narrow and grateful on the edges of other people's tables, and each of these was respectable, and the parish had made clear places for each. But glass and fire and bark and trade, a woman up a ladder in a canvas apron, a woman with an attorney, a woman with an acre, there was no place made for that, and what the parish has no place for, the parish calls a scandal. Lady Adeline Farrow made the ruling official within the week. At Pelling Court, over cards, with the vicar's wife and the doctor's wife and Mrs. Pratt herself in attendance, she dealt the sentence face up. I hear the little Swan has come into a quantity of broken windows, she said, and means to live in them. They tell me she has been seen carrying coals. I call it the greatest kindness Amos Faraby ever did the parish. We have wanted something to discuss all winter. The table laughed, some at the girl, some at the wit, 1 or 2 because laughing was cheaper than being next. Mrs. Pratt laughed with them, which she was ashamed of by Friday and defended until autumn. Word of the ruling reached Honora by 3 separate kindnesses inside 2 days, each messenger careful to be seen to be sorry. She thanked them and carried coals, because the acre had answered a question she had been carrying since she was 14, which was what all the Saturdays had been for, and the answer was written in 50 years of ruled pages in a hand she trusted past death. The trench book was not a diary. It was an engine. Every page paid twice, once in record, once in instruction. What the bark pit did at every depth and every month against every weather. Which fires drew in an east wind and which sulked, when to sow the first melons, and when the last, and the sums, always the sums. What a chaldron of coals cost against a load of bark. What the Canterbury inns paid for early cucumbers against what the London road would bear. What a pine cost to raise from sucker to table. 7 shillings and odd in fire and labor across 2 years. And what it sold for. 5 guineas and upward. And the fat honest difference between, written without underline or flourish, because Amos Ferriby thought profit, like piety, was a thing you did quietly or not at all. She read it as her father had taught her to read the barometer, twice over, once for what it said and once for what it was about to say. And it was about to say something. The back pages held his last 2 years. The hand was smaller, the entries shorter, and threaded through the fires and the sewings ran a second account she had to read 3 times before she would believe it, dated, sober, and impossible. 3rd October, 1814, no swallows since the 2nd week of September, earliest going in 40 years. 9th January, 1815, ice on the mill pond bore a wagon, has not done since 1795. 4th May, 1815, oak out before ash, yet the night's bitter, the signs cross each other, something is wrong in the upper weather. And then, in November of the year 1815, alone on its line, the sentence she would live inside for the next 18 months. The seasons are turning sick, the open ground will fail them all 1 year soon, and the year it does, glass will be gold. Mind the fires, Norrie, mind the fires. He had seen it coming. Nobody on earth could have said how, and the trench book did not explain, it only recorded. Swallows, and ice, and crossed signs. 55 years of England's weather ruled into columns until the columns themselves began to speak. That winter in the Atlantic the light was already strange, and sailors' wives from Deal to Dover were remarking the red of the evening sky, and on the far side of the world, though no Kentish newspaper would understand it for a decade, a mountain called Tambora had thrown half of itself into the heavens, and the ash was riding the high winds north, and the summer of 1816 was on its way to England like a bill coming due. Honora knew none of that. She knew a dead man she trusted had written Mind the Fires. It was enough to spend her savings on. She had £140 in the world, left from her father's pay and prize money, guarded through 8 years of her aunt's economies. She sat down with the trench book and a candle end and budgeted it like a ship victualled for a long chase. £9 for glass and putty and a glazier's 2 days. The rest of the roof she and Caleb would patch themselves. The book showed how. Painted canvas on the north slopes where light mattered least. £6 for coals, bought now, in April, when they were cheap, because the book said buy fuel when your neighbors are warm. £4.10 for fresh tanner's bark from Mr. Quested's yard at Luce, and the book noted that Quested's father would take payment half in forced salads for his inn-keeping brother, and she tried the son with the same bargain, and he blinked at her, and took it, and told his wife that evening the old man's ghost had been in, wearing a bonnet. £2 for seed, and the letter to Peake and Son of Hackney went off by the Wednesday coach, written plainly as instructed. Sirs, I am Honora Swan, heir by will to Amos Ferriby of Wychmere, his glass, his stock, and his book. He bade me trust you. I have his pines in all stages, 12 orange trees, and his methods, and I mean to carry his work on where he left it. Pray send me his account as it stands, your best melon and cucumber seed by the first coach, and your frank advice, which he valued, and so shall I. That left her 19 pounds and some shillings between herself and the parish's satisfaction, and she recorded it in the trench book's own manner, on a fresh page, under the heading, First Year under H.S. Caleb Nutley came back to the acre the morning after she asked him, though the asking had gone crooked, because he stood in his cottage door and heard her out with his cap in his hands, and then said, begging pardon, miss, but I must hear it plain. Is it wages or is it kindness? For I have had a winter of kindness, and it don't boil. Wages, she said. 8 shillings the week, paid Saturdays, out of my own purse until the ground pays it back, and then we shall talk again. And your boy Ned 2 shillings if he can carry water and hold his tongue. Caleb put his cap on, which was his signature to the agreement, and said the boy could carry water and would learn the other. He was 50, slow-spoken, wide as a door, and had been under gardener at the hall until the money died. And he knew the acre's fires as a sexton knows his bells, not why, but exactly when. What he thought of taking his orders from a woman of 24 he never said in 11 years, except once, that first April to the glazier who asked him how he liked his new master. Caleb considered the question through a whole pipe, and then said, her drills are straight, and her word is level, and she makes up a fire like the old one come again, and the man that finds a joke in that may carry his ladder home. They mended the south slopes first, glass where the sun crossed, canvas elsewhere, and cleaned 50 years of grime from the great lights with vinegar and river sand until the house stood full of plain daylight like a church at Easter. They turned the bark a foot deep and charged the second trench new from Quested's steaming load and fired the long flue that ran under the paved walk. And the old house drew and warmed end to end for the first time in years, and the pines answered inside a fortnight, new leaves at every heart, insolently green. Ned proved able to carry water and nearly able to hold his tongue. And the village lane developed a steady traffic of persons with sudden business past the acre's gate, who slowed and looked and carried their findings home. And the findings were troubling, because ruins are restful to a parish and work is an accusation. On the last day of April, a chaise and 4 came through Wickmere village from the London road, mud to the windows, and turned in at the hall gates that had stood chained for 2 years, and the news ran round the parish between dinner and dark. The heir was come, Mr. Quinton Locksley, great-nephew to old Everard, 30 years of age, late a captain of engineers in Spain and the Low Countries, sole legatee of a proud name, a hollow house, and a mortgaged estate that his lawyers valued, with fees at rather less than nothing. The parish, which had been starved of gentry, resolved to admire him. Lady Farrow sent a card the first day. Mr. Dodd the steward was at the hall door before the horses were cool, with his books under his arm, and among the books, near the top, flagged with a slip of green paper, was the matter of the gardener's acre, which Mr. Dodd had already described in a letter to the family's London attorney as a trespass of long standing, lately inherited by a young person of no property, which a firm hand might resolve to the estate's considerable advantage before the summer was out. The first meeting went wrong in the manner that matters most, which is politely. Honora was up the wall ladder at the lane end of the acre, in her canvas apron, sleeves pinned back, setting a pane in the top course with her mouth full of glazing points, when a tall man on a gray horse stopped in the lane below and watched her drive the putty home with a thumbstroke a glazier would have owned to, and said, with real pleasure and no judgment in it at all, "Your master keeps his glass better than my great-uncle kept his. I had heard the whole quarter was dead. I should like to see his stove trenches if he would show them." Honora took the points from her mouth. She had heard the chaise had come. She looked down at the gray horse's rider, a lean, weathered man with a soldier's seat and his hat in his hand to her, which he would not have done had he known, and she said, "The glass has no master, sir. It has a mistress, and I am she. And the trenches are firing this hour, and I would show them gladly to any neighbor. But I think you are my adversary, and you should know it before you dismount." Mr. Quentin Locksley sat his horse very still for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Swan, I take it. My steward gives me to understand the acre is hall land, and I am advised I am obliged to pursue it, and I am too new here to know better yet. I am sorry it falls so. It seemed to me a house worth saving, whoever's it proves." He put his hat on and rode for the gates, and Honora went back up the ladder and set the next pane crooked, and took it out, and set it right, and said nothing. And Caleb at the wall foot studied the sky, and remarked that the wind was gone round to the east, which in Caleb was a whole chapter on the nature of the gentry. That evening she wrote the day into the trench book, expenses, weather, work, in the ruled manner. Then, because the book had taught her that the crossed signs are the ones worth recording, she added one line of her own. The new master of the hall is courteous, well-meaning, and wrong, which the book says is the most dangerous kind. Mind the 9th course. Peak and Son answered by return of coach, which in the trade was a bow. The letter was in a young man's hand and an old man's voice, and it began, "Madam, your letter grieved and gladdened this house in equal parts, for we had not heard of Mr. Ferriby's death, and my father wept at the counter, which the apprentices had not seen before and will not forget." The account stood thus. Amos Ferriby had for 30 years supplied Peak and Son with what no money could order, proved stock and proved knowledge, suckers of his own pine strain, which the trade called Ferriby's Kent and paid a premium for, cuttings, grafts, and above all his letters, which the elder Peak had kept in a drawer like scripture. Against this the nursery held a credit in his favor of £58 11s, which they now owed his heir, and would pay in coin or in kind at her direction, and their advice, frankly given as requested, was this: "Do not sell the credit for coin, madam. Take it in glass, in seed, and in stock, and take also this intelligence, which we have from every correspondent we possess between Cornwall and the Tweed. The season is 6 weeks backward and getting worse. Fruit has failed in blossom from one end of the country to the other. Our forcing houses are besieged already by stewards whose walled gardens have given them nothing, and it is not yet May. If your trenches are truly firing, madam, you are this year in possession of what half the great tables of England will shortly discover they cannot buy. Your servant, Barnabas Peak the younger." Honora read the letter twice, entered £58 11s in the book with a steady hand, and sat for a while with her father's kind of stillness, the stillness of a man reading weather that has not arrived. Then she wrote back, taking the credit thus: 1 chest of the best melon and cucumber seed, 6 rolls of oiled paper, 200 feet of small glass, a barrel of the Dutch tulip and hyacinth roots for winter forcing, and the balance to stand on account against the autumn. And she asked one question plainly, as instructed: "What does a fruiting pine fetch at Christmas? In town, in a bad year?" The answer, when it came, she did not enter in the book. She folded it into the back cover, where he had kept his own dangerous arithmetic, because some numbers, written where a steward's lawyer might one day read them, change from information into evidence. May came in cold as March had gone out. The oaks stood half-dressed. Cottage gardens that should have been white with bloom showed black spurs and bare wands, and old men who remembered the famine springs of the last century began to be listened to at the forge again. On the acre, under-mended glass, over-fired trenches, it was July. The first melons set and swelled in their frames. The early cucumbers went to the George at Maidstone, 2 dozen at a time, at a price the landlord paid without blinking twice, because the coaching trade must have its show whatever the sky does, and no other garden within 30 miles had a cucumber to sell him. She entered every shilling. By the last week of May, the acre had earned £11 4 shillings, and the parish had adjusted its sneer from the girl is mad to the girl is grasping, which any student of parishes will recognize as progress. Silas Ferriby chose that week to strike, which was not chance. Ruins may be pitied, but takings must be shared, and the news of the George's cucumbers travelled the Faversham road faster than the coach that carried them. He entered a caveat against the will in the court at Canterbury, and the ground he chose was not forgery, for the vicar and the sexton had witnessed the signing and would say so, but the elder and softer ground of unsound mind and undue influence. His uncle, the pleading ran, had in his last years been enfeebled in his understanding, known to the whole parish for his strangeness, and in that enfeebled state had been worked upon by an artful young person who had for years attached herself to a lonely old man with an eye to his property. It was clever, because it was almost the truth turned inside out, and the almost true travels further than the false, and there was matter for it, which is the bitter part. Amos Ferriby had been strange. He had talked to things. The whole parish had heard him at it, over the wall, down the years, a low, steady murmur among the pots when he thought himself alone, and boys had dared each other to listen, and reported that the old man talked to the rosemary bush by the stove-shed door, talked to it like a Christian, asked it questions and waited on the answers. The pleading did not say that his wife Susanna, 40 years dead, had planted that rosemary the spring they married, and that a man who has worked alone for a lifetime keeps his dead where he can tend them. The pleading said, talks to shrubs, and let the court's imagination do the rest. And in the parish, the phrase did a summer's work in a fortnight. Mrs. Pratt read the pleading, or heard it read, and arrived at the acre in her good bonnet with the light of rescue in her eye. You see where it has led, she said. An artful young person. Your name in a court paper joined to those words, read by clerks and next by newspapers. There is one door out of this, and I have held it open since April. Sell to Mr. Ferriby. Withdraw your claim. Let the lawyers divide the ashes, and in a year the parish will have forgotten, and you may yet marry a curate. Honora was potting suckers at the bench while her aunt spoke, and she finished the row before she answered, firming each one with 2 fingers exactly as deep as the book prescribed, and no deeper. Aunt, she said, when my father's ship went down, you took me in, and I have never once heard the cost of it from you, whatever else I have heard, and I will not forget that when this is over. But look down this house before you choose Silas Ferriby's side of it. Every leaf you can see is alive, because one old man refused 8 years of excellent advice. The parish told him to let it die, and he fed it in the dark out of his own pocket, and the parish called him mad for it. And now his nephew calls him mad in a court of law and offers me £12 for the proof that he was the sanest man in Kent. I'll not sell the proof, Aunt. I mean to grow it. Her aunt stood a long moment among the warm ranks with her rescue dying in her hands. She was not a fool, only frightened, and she had been poor in a genteel way for 30 years, which teaches a woman that safety is the only crop that never fails. She left without surrendering, but at the gate she paused and said, without turning, the cucumbers at the George, they are speaking of them in Maidstone, and it is not all unkind, and then she was gone up the lane at her best pace, having given away more ground in 2 clauses than in the whole spring's campaign. The buyout came the following Tuesday, and it came, to its small credit, in person. Mr. Quentin Locksley walked the lane with Mr. Dodd at his shoulder, like a conscience hired by the quarter, and Honora received them at the gate and did not open it, and the 3 of them conducted the parish's favorite scene of the season across 4 feet of oak paling. Mr. Dodd began, with the will disputed and the title clouded, would Miss Swan not prefer certainty? The estate, without admitting her claim in any particular, would pay £25 for a full surrender, which for a ruin under litigation was, he ventured, generous to the point of folly. Honora said, Mr. Dodd, your figure values the glass, the iron, and my inconvenience. I will tell you what it does not value. It does not value 32 pine plants of a private strain 30 years in the proving, 5 of them fruiting, which will bring 5 guineas each in town this Christmas if I do nothing cleverer than keep the fires in. It does not value 12 bearing orange trees, nor the only heated ground between here and Canterbury in the year the open gardens have already failed. Ask your own kitchen, sir, what it has picked since Easter. Your £25 is the price of the acre's funeral, and the acre is not dead. I have entered your offer in my book as I enter the weather. Dodd's jaw set, but it was Locksley who answered, and he answered slowly, like a man doing sums he dislikes. You mean to hold it through the courts then alone? If it must be through the courts, she said, then through the courts. But you should know it will not be alone in the way you mean. I have his book. Every fire this ground has drawn since before your great-uncle was master, every load of bark, every shilling in and out, and his purchase of this acre, noted plain in the year 1769. A man does not keep 50 years of honest accounts of land he stole. Mind you, Mr. Locksley, I do not say you steal. I say you have been told a story, and you have not yet asked to see whether it is written down anywhere but in Mr. Dodd's ledger. Locksley looked at his steward then, only a glance, but Honora saw it land, and so did Dodd, whose ears went the color of new brick. The trouble, when Mr. Crump investigated in earnest, was this. Amos's letter and Amos's book both spoke of the purchase, but the deed itself, the parchment that would end the matter in an afternoon, was nowhere. Not with the will, not at the cottage, not in the iron box, not lodged with any attorney in Maidstone or Canterbury that Crump could raise an answer from. The old squire's muniment room at the Hall held the estate's own papers, and Dodd had been through them, or said he had, and reported no trace of any conveyance to any gardener, and smiled while he reported it. Without the deed, Crump warned her. Possession and the book might carry the day in the end, but the end would be years off, and ruinous dear. And Locksley's London men knew it, and would wait her purse out. Find the parchment, Miss Swan, he said, or make the acre pay for a siege. She rode home from Maidstone in the carrier's cart, with the trench book on her knees, and put the question to the only counsel she trusted, and the book answered, as it always answered, with what it had instead of comfort, which was pattern. Amos Ferriby had hidden nothing in 50 years except one thing, £60 of savings, and the book recorded even that, in his one line of cipher under the great frost of 1814, moved the iron box to the 3rd flue. A house that keeps its heat keeps its papers. He hid what mattered inside the thing he trusted, inside the work itself, where no steward would think to put his hand, because no steward ever built a fire. She read the line about the 9th course again, mind the 9th course, and for the first time it looked less like an old man's fussing over brickwork and more like a bearing on a chart. But June was on the doorstep, the melons were swelling, the The caveat was listed for the autumn sessions, and whatever was or was not laid up in the ninth course of anything would keep, because it had kept this long. She wrote in the book, 29th May, cold northeast wind 3 days, sky a strange high haze, sun red at noon as at evening, the old men are afraid and will not say of what, and Caleb Nutley stood in the doorway of the stove shed that same evening, smelling the wind like a dog, and said the words the whole country would be saying by August. Miss, I don't like this summer. It has come up wrong, like bread that won't prove. We should get more fuel in, and get it now, while the getting is soft. She looked at the sums, and the sums said no, and she looked at the sky, and the sky said what the book had said in November. Mind the fires. She bought the fuel. It took 9 of her last 14 pounds, a full stack of cordwood and a barge load of coals off the Medway at low summer price, carted and housed dry by the 1st of June. And the parish found it the best joke of the season. The glass girl laying in winter coals at midsummer, and Lady Farrow was heard to say that the poor creature had at least chosen her madness from the family stock. 11 days later, on the night of the 12th of June, in the year 1816, the frost came. It came without cloud, which is the killing kind, a green evening sky washed clean by the northeast wind, and then the wind itself lying down at dusk like an accomplice. And by 10 the grass in the churchyard was stiffening, and the thermometer at the acre's door, her father's naval thermometer, carried from the sea to the sill, sank through the 30s while she watched it by lantern light. On the 12th of June, with the hay half won, and the corn in the milk, and every cottage garden in the parish standing full and green and defenseless, Caleb was at the gate by 10:30 without being sent for, and Ned behind him with a barrow of the smudge pots they had made in April against spring frosts and never used, old iron kettles, and broken flower pots packed with tarred rope ends and damp straw. They set them along the outside of the south wall at 8 paces, a slow, filthy smolder to move the air, and hung the spare mats over the north canvas, and then Honora did the thing the trench book prescribed for a black frost and no other, the thing that cost most and could not be taken back. She opened the fires full, both trenches, the long flue, the whole of April's economy roaring away up the stove, shed chimney into a sky like iron, burning the winter's coals in midsummer on the word of a dead man, and Caleb stoked. And she walked the house with a lantern all night, reading the glass at each station. 61 degrees over the pit at midnight, 59 at 2, 58 at 4 and holding, while outside the panes the parish of Wickmere quietly froze. Toward 3 in the morning, standing at the south lights with her shawl over her mouth, she watched the frost flower on the outside of the glass an inch from her face, fern and feather and spear, the whole cold sky pressing its signature against her windows, and on her side of that one skin of glass, in the red half-dark, the pines went on breathing their heavy green breath as though Kent were Jamaica. Nothing between the parish and ruin that night but 60 years of method and 9 pounds of foresighted coal. The morning was worse than the night, because the morning showed the bill. The sun came up red on a black country. Potato fields lay scorched as if fire had crossed them. The bean rows hung like wet rags. Cottage gardens that had stood a week from feeding families through the autumn were gone to the ground. And the wheat caught flowering, browned in the ear through the following fortnight until men walked into their own fields, rubbed out a head, and came away with nothing in the palm but chaff. It was the same at Luce and at Linton, the same at Canterbury, the same, though the parish would be weeks learning it, from Cornwall to Aberdeen and across the sea in France and the German lands. Worse, the year 1816 was to have no summer, and the 12th of June was the night it said so. She did not learn Locksley's share of it until the frost's second night, when the boy from the Hall stables came down the lane at a run just after dark, hatless, and stood gasping at her gate with a message he had plainly carried against orders. The old vinery flue was down, choked and cracked at the breast where 2 years of neglect had rotted the mortar, the fire drawing backward into the house, smoke among the vines, cold coming in behind it, and Mr. Locksley in his shirt sleeves trying to hold the temperature with braziers, which any gardener could have told him would gas the whole crop by morning. The great-uncle's vines, the boy said, near 90 years old, the master had been at them since April like they were kin. Mr. Dodd had said let them go. They were not worth a mason's bill. The master would not, and the master was losing. Honora stood in her doorway with the frost already whitening the gate rail, and every sensible consideration lined up on one side of her, and she heard them all out. The man was her adversary. His lawyers were waiting out her purse, her own fires needed watching, her own glass was carrying the only unfrozen produce in the parish, and if his vines died, hers were worth the more. That was the arithmetic, and Amos Ferriby had kept accounts all his life, and she had his book by heart. But it was his book, and in it, under February of the year 1799, was written, "Walk to Linton in the snow this night to fire Parson Gedge's little house for him, his man being drunk. A garden in trouble is nobody's enemy." She took Caleb, the long flue rods, a bag of fire clay, and 2 lanterns, and went up through the frozen park to the house of the man whose steward was trying to take her land. They worked from 11 until past 4. Caleb crawled the flue like a badger, found the choke, broke it, and pointed the cracked breast with fire clay by lantern light, while Honora rigged the vinery's abandoned bark pit, dead these 2 years, into a night's worth of gentle heat, the only way the hour allowed. 6 barrow loads of fresh horse litter from the Hall stables, forked and watered and capped with old tan. A fermenting heap breathing warmth like a sleeping ox by 1 in the morning. Locksley fetched and carried and held lanterns and did as he was bid by a woman in a canvas apron and a man he had half believed his steward's account of, and asked no question all night except useful ones, and at some point in that long, cold middle watch, without a word being spent on it, the 3 of them stopped being adversaries who happened to share a ladder, and became what people become at, fires and floods and lambings, hands at the same work. At 4, with the glass over the vines reading 51 and rising, and the smoke drawing sweet up the mended breast, they stood in the potting room drinking the Hall's brandy out of the Hall's teacups, filthy as tinkers all 3, and Locksley looked at his own hands, blistered across both palms from the flue rods, with a kind of wonder, and then at her, and said, "My steward values that house at nothing, my lawyers value your acre at everything, and I begin to think, Miss Swan, that I have been keeping my accounts in the wrong men's figures." She was too tired to be clever, which was as well, for what she said instead was true. "Your vines are your great-uncle's 50 years, sir," she said. "Mine are Amos Ferriby's. We are neither of us defending property. We are defending the dead men who trusted us with it, and that is why you would not let Mr. Dodd talk you out of a mason's bill, and why I will not let him talk me out of an acre." He walked her and Caleb to the park gate through the white ruin of the dawn, and at the gate he stopped and said, "The suit is not mine to drop, while the title is questioned. My duty to the estate is real, and I'll not insult you by pretending otherwise. But from this morning it will be conducted as between neighbors, at law and nowhere else, and Mr. Dodd will learn the difference by noon, And if your fires ever fail on a bad night, you will send to me as I should have had the sense to send to you. It was not peace. It was the beginning of the possibility of it, which in a long war is the greater event. The frost's harvest came in through July, and it was bitter. Rain fell for 3 weeks with hardly a dry noon, cold slanting rain out of a sky like a slate roof. The hay rotted in the swathe. Wheat stood green into August with winter coming up behind it like a bailiff. Bread rose a penny, then twopence, then beyond. And the talk at the forge stopped being about weather and began being about the poor rates. And the overseers of 3 parishes met early, in July, which the oldest man at the meeting had never known. And through that drowned and darkening country, twice a week, the carrier's cart went up from the acre at Wickmere, loaded under oilcloth with what no open ground in Kent could show. Melons netted in their frames, cucumbers, forced kidney beans, salads crisp out of the warm dark, cherries ripened in pots under glass, and the George paid, and the Star at Canterbury paid. And a hotel at Tunbridge Wells sent its own wagon, and by the middle of August the first year's page in the trench book showed the acre had taken 63 pounds since April, with the pines, the great cards, still unplayed in her hand. She was not oblivious to what it meant, selling luxuries dear across a hungry summer. The book had a rule for that too. Entered in the famine spring of 1795, sell the rich man his melon, feed the poor man from the trial rose, Glass owes the parish a tithe in a bad year. She kept it to the letter. The trial beds and the second pickings went out the acre's back gate quietly, to the vicar for pointing wherever want was worst. And Mr. Herriard held his tongue about the source, mostly, and where he did not, the parish heard of it, and the word grasping began, here and there, in kitchens and at the forge, to lose its grip. The hunger came on with the autumn, and it came into her own gate first through Ned. The boy had been growing all summer on his 2 shillings and the acre's dinners, and then in the last week of August he stopped growing and started saving, and Caleb, who missed nothing and mentioned less, finally mentioned it. The boy's father had been a hay dealer's man, and there was no hay, and no work in a country where the harvest itself had failed. And there were 5 below Ned at home, and the boy was carrying his dinner out the gate in his kerchief every day, and eating, so far as Caleb could determine, bread and pride. Honora did not raise his wages, because the trench book had a rule about that too. Written after the famine spring of 1795, wages answer work, want answers want, muddle the two, and you spoil both the man and the account. Instead, she put the boy's mother to work, 2 days a week at the washing and the hamper packing at a fair wage honestly earned, and sent the family what the book called the growing wage, milk and meal, charged in the book as plainly as coals. And when Ned understood what had been done, and tried, scarlet to the ears, to say something at the potting bench, she told him what Amos Ferriby had told her across the same bench 8 years before, when her own dinners had been thin and her pride thick. Eat, boy, you are no use to me hollow, and the account is square. For I had this dinner off an old man once, and you will stand someone else's dinner when your time comes. That is how the debt travels. It never goes back. It only goes on. By the last days of August, the overseers of the poor were sitting weekly instead of quarterly, and the parish rates had climbed past anything in the oldest book. And it was Mr. Herriard who brought the 2 overseers down the lane one wet evening at the summer's end, apologetic as a man leading a raid on a friend, to put to her the question nobody in Kent had ever put to a woman of 24. The parish faced a winter it could not feed on a rate it could not raise, and the vicar had told them. quietly, whose baskets had gone out the acre's back gate since June. And what they had come to ask was not charity, for charity they could get in sermons, but method. Could early food be raised, cheap, at scale, on parish ground, by parish labor, under the sort of management that made her acre answer? And if it could, would she teach it? She took them into the stove shed out of the rain and gave them the book's own answer, which was yes with figures attached. Not pines, not oranges, nothing under glass. Glass was capital, and the parish had none. Hotbeds, dung frames, the poor man's stove, fresh stable litter and old canvas lights, the method every great garden used and no cottage did, because nobody had ever walked down the lane and shown them. Frames on the sheltered south side of the workhouse garden, built by the parish's own idle hands this winter, fired with the one crop the coaching towns of Kent would never run short of, and sown hard from February. Early potatoes, carrots, salads, the hungry gap food that came when the cottage gardens stood empty and the prices stood cruelest. She costed it at the bench while they watched. So much for canvas, so much for boards, the dung to be had of the George's stables for the carting, and Caleb to give the workhouse men 2 mornings a week of instruction through the winter at her charge. And she finished it in the book's manner, gentlemen. The parish will not grow rich, but by April it will grow breakfast. And a parish that grows its own breakfast has stopped being afraid, which is worth more than the potatoes. The overseers walked back up the lane in the rain with their costings in an inside pocket, and one of them, old Mr. Crake the miller, who had voted her mad at the vestry in the spring by way of general principle, stopped at the gate and looked back down the acre to where the glass glowed faint with the evening fires, and said to the vicar, in the hearing of the boy carrying their lantern, "Well, I said the girl was cracked. And I'll say this too. It is a queer sort of cracked that keeps a parish." And the remark traveled, as he had perhaps intended, and did its work in kitchens where the word grasping had lately been losing its hold. If you have stayed beside Honora through this frozen summer, through frost and law and 50 years of a dead man's fires, then stay for what winter brings her, because the hardest blows and the great vindication are still to come. And if this story has warmed you at all, subscribe, so that you and I may keep our own fires together. The pines fatten through August in their beds of heat, 5 crowned heads swelling toward Christmas. And Honora walked the ranks each evening with the lantern as the light died earlier and earlier, and totted her sums, and watched her 2 dangers ripen on the same stalk of autumn. The caveat would be heard at Canterbury in October. And Mr. Barnabas Peake's folded answer in the back cover of the trench book, the number she had never entered in any page a lawyer might subpoena, said that a fruiting pine in town at Christmas in a bad year, delivered fresh with its crown onto a nobleman's table, would fetch not 5 guineas but 10, and that Peake and Son stood ready to take every fruit she could send, and asked only one question: "How many, madam, and how soon?" The order that changed the scale of everything came in September, on paper so heavy it stood up by itself on the potting bench. The Earl of Sandgate, whose seat lay 12 miles off toward the coast, and whose walled gardens, like everyone's, had given him a summer of nothing, was to entertain at Christmas a party that included, his house steward's letter implied without daring to say, persons whose rank the reader was invited to imagine. The Earl's own pinery had stood cold since his gardener died in the spring, and the Earl's steward had made inquiries, and the inquiries, to the parish's lasting astonishment, all pointed down a lane in Wickmere to an acre behind an oak paling. 8 fruiting pines, the letter proposed, delivered fresh in the week before Christmas, at 4 guineas each, terms on receipt. Honora read it at the bench, with Caleb looking over her shoulder in open defiance of every rule of service. And Caleb said, 4 guineas, and made a noise in his chest like a stove door shutting. And Honora took up her pen and wrote what the trench book, 50 years of the trench book, had taught her to write. My lord's steward is thanked. The price is 10 guineas the fruit, cut with its crown the same morning it travels, or 8 guineas if his lordship's wagon fetches. She set out her reasons with the sums attached, what 2 years of fire cost, what Peak and Son would pay in town for every fruit she could send, what it meant to be the only firing pinery in that corner of Kent in the year 1816. The steward's answer took 9 days, which was pride, and agreed to everything, which was arithmetic. 8 fruit at 10 guineas, his lordship's wagon notwithstanding, for his lordship did not haggle, a phrase worth 10 guineas by itself. And she entered the contract in the book and sat looking at the figure. 80 guineas, 4 years of a curate's stipend, hanging by their stalks in her hot dark, with December still 3 months off, and everything in the world still able to go wrong. What went wrong first was the sky, which had one more blow in it. On the 29th of September, a storm came up the channel and turned inland over Kent in the black of the evening, and it carried hail. Not the spring pepper that rattles and melts, but flat-edged midsummer-grown hail off a sky that had been wrong all year. Stones the size of musket balls coming in on a 50-mile wind, and it fell on the acre's glass at 9 at night like a company firing volleys. She was in the house when it began, and the sound was past describing, and there was nothing to be done in the first fury but stand under the stoutest rafter with a mat held over her head and count the losses by ear. Pane after pane going in overhead, the crash, and then the sluicing tinkle, and then the wet wind coming in the hole, and the lanterns swinging, and the pines standing in their pit, with hailstones bouncing among them like grape-shot. It stopped in 20 minutes. It had broken 41 panes, stripped the canvas from half the north slope, and put out 1 trench fire with the water that followed it down, against a night wind falling toward frost, with the 2 most valuable ranks of plants under open sky. And then lanterns in the lane. 6 of them, and men under the lanterns, the Hall's men, with 2 wagon tarpaulins, ladders, and Locksley in a boat cloak, come at the run before she had sent, because he had stood at his own windows watching the hail whiten his terrace and done the sum in his head. They roofed the wounds in tarpaulin by midnight, relit the drowned fire, picked glass out of the bark by lantern light until 2, and Locksley worked the ladders himself alongside Caleb, passing battens, his blistered summer hands long-heeled and harder now. And he took orders from her without ceremony, and gave none except to his own men. And when it was done, and the house stood dark and patched and breathing again, they drank the same brandy out of the same teacups, and nobody said anything worth recording, because everything worth recording had been done instead of said. The glazier's bill for the storm was £11, and she paid it out of melons. Peak and Son sent the 200 feet of small glass ahead of the account as a mark of esteem, and the parish, which had watched the Hall's lanterns go down the lane through the hail, and had watched them come back at 2 in the morning, drew the one conclusion parishes always draw, and drew it wrong in the usual direction, and the story that the new master was courting the glass girl was in 3 villages by Sunday and at Pelling Court by Monday. Lady Farrell received it as a personal affront. She had planned, in the mild way great ladies plan the lives of others between hands of cards, a marriage for Mr. Locksley, a proper one, an heiress got through her own connections, the mended fortunes to be in some part her work and her credit. A nobody in a canvas apron, holding a disputed acre against him at law while thawing him by lantern light, offended her plan, her order, and her winter's entertainment altogether. And Lady Pharaoh at war was a serious weather system in her own right. She called on Mrs. Pratt, ostensibly about the poor basket subscription, and left behind her, in the way of ladies who never say anything actionable, the distinct understanding that if the niece's adventure ended in scandal, the aunt's card table would feel it first, and Mrs. Pratt walked to the acre that same evening at a pace unsuited to her years and stood among the pines ringing the strings of her reticule. "She says nothing and means everything," said her aunt. "You do not know what she can do in a parish." "Aunt," said Honora, "I am 24, I hold a freehold, or shall when the law is done," stammering. "I owe no debts, I pay 2 wages every Saturday, and I have contracted this week to sell an Earl 8 pineapples at 10 guineas the fruit. What Lady Pharaoh can do in a parish I have watched all my life. What I cannot afford is to spend 1 hour of this autumn being afraid of it." Her aunt stopped ringing the reticule. 10 guineas, she said, in spite of herself, the fruit. And then, sitting down slowly on the potting bench like a woman easing into water, "Tell me the whole of it, Honora, the sums." From April. So Honora told her, April to Michaelmas, cucumbers to contract, out of the trench book, and her aunt, corn factor's widow, followed every figure with her lips moving, and at the end of it she sat quiet a moment and then said the first fully honest thing she had said since March. "I told them you were mad because I was frightened, and I was frightened because your mother was the clever one and it took her to a poor man's grave, and I could not see that you had got his weather eye along with her wits, and, well, bring me a melon Thursday, I have Mrs. Harryard at 4, and I should like once in my life to serve what Pellingcourt cannot get." It was not a surrender Lady Pharaoh ever heard the terms of. It was better. It was defection. Silas Ferriby spent that same autumn losing ground and knowing it, which in a man of his grain is the recipe for one last throw. His lawyer had told him in September what the depositions looked like. The vicar and the sexton stood by the signing, hale and unshakable. Half a parish stood ready to swear the old man sharp as a pruning knife to his last week, and the tale of the rosemary, on which the whole edifice of unsound mind had been raised, had a plain answer waiting for it in open court, and worse, a sympathetic one. And so, with the hearing set for the last week of October, Silas came down the lane to the acre one evening, alone, to make the offer his kind always makes when the cards turn, the offer to be bought out of being a nuisance. £200, he said. Standing at the gate he was not asked through, to withdraw the caveat. Quiet and neighborly. No court, no costs, no names in the Kentish Gazette. "You are selling an Earl pineapples, I hear. You can find it, or borrow it against the £50 he left me, which I have not touched. Tell your attorney." "You are asking me," said Honora, "to pay you £200 for the pleasure of proving your uncle sane. I'll prove it for the price of the court's fee, Mr. Ferriby, and count it cheap, and the Gazette may print what the court finds, and I hope it prints it large." He looked at her a long moment over the paling, and something moved behind his face that was not quite shame and was related to it. He said, "He never once wrote to me, you know. 50 years not 2 miles off, and never once." Then he settled his hat and walked back up the lane toward Faversham, and Honora stood at the gate with her anger draining out of her into the cold evening, because the trench book held 12 letters, pressed flat in the back pages, all in one hand, all beginning "Dear Uncle," all asking for money, and not one asking how the old man did, and she knew something Silas Farabee had chosen his whole life not to know, that the door he was mourning had stood open, and he had only ever come to it with his hand out. October closed in wet and early dark. The pines swelled. The first of the Dutch roots went into the forcing pit for the winter trade, and on the last Monday of the month, in the consistory court at Canterbury, in a room smelling of coal smoke and wet wool, the matter of the will of Amos Farabee, gardener, deceased, was called at last, and Honora Swan put on her mother's gray silk, took the trench book under her arm because she could not have said why, and went to hear a judge decide whether the sanest man in Kent had been mad. The court was smaller than her fear had built it, a paneled room off the cathedral precincts with a fire that smoked, a judge with a cold, 2 proctors, a clerk, and benches for such of the public as had nothing better to do on a wet Monday, which in a hungry October was more of the public than usual. Silas's proctor opened with the story his client had paid for, told smoothly, an old man childish with age, an artful young person insinuated into his affections across 8 years, the natural heir supplanted, and the strangeness, always the strangeness, a man known through the parish to hold conversation with a shrub, and with such a mind, he asked the smoking fire, a mind to devise an acre. Then the witnesses, and the story met the parish it had been told about. Mr. Harryard the vicar, asked if the testator was of sound mind at the signing, replied that he had put that very question to himself as a duty, had talked with Amos Farabee an hour that day, had been corrected by him twice on the dates of the frosts of 1795, and had come away reflecting that if Amos Farabee was unsound, then the parish must pray for the infection to spread. Asked about the young person's influence, he said, "She influenced him to keep living, sir, which at 85 wants doing, and I saw who carried whose baskets, and it was never his carrying hers." The sexton, Isaac Toll, deposed that he had witnessed the will, that the testator had read every line of it aloud to him and Mr. Harryard first, and had then remarked that a man should sign nothing he could not read out plain to 2 friends, which the sexton offered to the court as a standard of soundness the court itself might profit by, and was reproved, and looked pleased about it. Then the proctor for the will called Caleb Nutley, which Honora had argued against, fearing what a clever man might do with him, and Mr. Crump had insisted upon, because juries and judges believe slow men who will not be hurried, and Caleb would not have been hurried by cannon fire. It was Caleb the Rosemary question came to, as they had known it must. "Your late master was heard," said Silas's proctor, with the delicacy of a man laying a snare in open view, speaking to a rosemary bush, frequently over years. "Do you say that is the habit of a sound mind?" Caleb thought about it, at his own pace while the room waited. "Sir," he said at last, "his wife Susanna set that bush the year they wed, and she died of a childbed fever the year after. And he tended it 41 years, and yes, he spoke to it, mornings mostly, while he took his pipe, and I'll tell you what he said, for I heard it 100 times and never once let on. He told her the weather, what was in flower, what the girl had done that week that would have made her laugh. Then he'd knock out his pipe and go to work." The room had gone very quiet. Caleb looked at the judge and finished the job in the fewest words of the day. "My own wife is 9 years gone, sir. I do the same at her stone every Sunday after church, and if that is madness, you must build a bigger asylum, for you will have most of Kent in it." The judge blew his nose at length, remarked that grief holding fast to a living thing seemed to the court closer to constancy than to lunacy, and heard the rest of the evidence at a pace that suggested his mind had gone ahead to its dinner, with the matter already settled. Judgment was given before Advent. The will of Amos Farabee was pronounced for in full, the caveat dismissed, and costs. The sting that made the Gazette paragraphs sing costs against Silas Farabee, who had gambled his uncle's £50 on the chance of an acre and now owed most of it to 2 sets of lawyers for the privilege of hearing his uncle called sane and himself called, between the lines where courts keep their plain speech, a disappointed legacy hunter. He did not look at Honora as the court rose. She was spared deciding what her face should do, and was grateful, and entered the judgment in the trench book that evening under its date. Will proved, costs to the caveator, and underneath, because the book had taught her that every account has 2 columns, he waited at the door for me after, and said, "Tell me one thing. Did he ever speak of me?" And I said, "He kept your letters, all 12, pressed flat like leaves," and he looked at me as men look when the sum comes out against them past appeal, and walked to the Faversham coach in the rain. The probate victory settled the will and settled nothing else, for the will could only give what Amos owned, and whether Amos owned the acre was the question still standing in the London attorney's letters like a bailiff at a wedding. Through November, Mr. Dodd pressed it with a new edge, because Mr. Dodd's own position had begun to want defending. His master had taken to reading, of all things, the estate's old account books, whole evenings of them, and asking questions a steward prefers to be asked never, such as why the Home Farms wool clip had fetched 4 pence under market 3 years running, and to whom exactly the fallen timber from the park had been sold in the shut-up years, and by what arithmetic. A steward under a reading master needs either clean books or a distraction, and Dodd's books were what 2 unwatched years had made them, and the acre was the best distraction on the property. Recover the gardener's acre, prove himself the estate's watchdog, and the wool and the timber might stay in their kennels. So the estate's formal claim went forward to be heard at the spring assizes at Maidstone. Ejectment. The whole title to be tried before a jury of Kentish freeholders, and the London attorney's opinion, furnished at 3 guineas and worth the money, ran thus. The lady's case stood on possession, on reputation, and on entries in a private book, respectable evidence, none of it parchment. The estate's case stood on the older manor records showing the acre within the demesne, and on the simple, brutal absence of any deed out. Juries liked parchment. If no conveyance could be produced, the estate would likely recover. With the improvements, the trenches, the stock, the glass she had paid to mend, all of it passing with the soil. For whatever is built on land, the law presumes, belongs to the land. She read that opinion which Locksley sent her himself, under a note in his own hand, saying, "You should see what is ranged against you. I will not win in the dark against a neighbor who fires my vines at midnight." And she carried it out to the acre and stood a long time in the warm aisle between the pines, in the smell of bark and oranges that was now the smell of her whole life, doing what her father did when the glass fell fast at sea, which was not to hope, but to make the ship ready. The deed existed. She had stopped doubting that. Amos did not write purchases into 50 years of accounts that never happened. The deed existed, and Amos had hidden it, and he had hidden it late after the old squire died. When the hall fell among lawyers, and a steward began walking the boundaries with a measuring chain, and an old man past 80, alone, distrusting every coat in the county, had put the one parchment that made him a freeholder, where he put everything he could not afford to lose. Not in the cottage which the estate might search or claim, not with any attorney, for the attorney he trusted was dead before him. Inside the work, where the damp could not get it, and no steward would ever think, because no steward ever built a fire. Mind the 9th course. She had the whole of it now except the place, and December spent itself while she looked, prizing at the 9th brick course of the great stove's firebox by candlelight until her nails broke, walking the 2 trenches, counting courses down from the coping and up from the footing, sounding the stove shed's 9 shelves, the 9th flag of the walk, the 9th rafter, the 9th tub, and finding mortar, mice, and nothing. Caleb watched her at it for a fortnight before he said his word. "Miss," he said, "you are counting his bricks. Count his years." The book was open on the bench between them, and she stood very still and then began turning pages with cold fingers, because the trench book ran in courses too. One ruled opening to a season, and Amos Farabee had numbered them, every year of keeping, in the top corner in his own small figures. Course 1 in the year 1765 when he first began the book as a young man, Course 2 the year following, and so by that reckoning the 9th course was the year 1773. And she found the opening for 1773 and read it through 3 times before she saw it. And when she saw it, she sat down on the potting stool because her knees had gone. The entries for that spring recorded the building of the South Trench, his own hands, brick by brick, the trench that had warmed melons for 40 years, and one line in March stood a half-inch proud of its ruled neighbors. The ink heavier, retraced years later by an old hand over a young one so that it should not fade, laid this day in the South Trench, at the 9th course from the footing, beneath the 2nd bond stone from the stokehole, a thing to keep dry, God keep the fire gentle over it. He had built his strong room 40 years before he needed it, and told his book, and trusted his book to tell whoever he trusted with his book. The South Trench was firing, and had been firing since April, with December's pines standing sunk in its heat, and 80 guineas hanging by their stalks above the very bricks. To open the 9th course now meant drawing the fire, cooling the bed, lifting the stock in midwinter, and gambling the Earl's contract and the whole crowning crop of her first year against a parchment that had to be there and might not be. The assizes sat in March. The pines went to Sandgate the 3rd week of December. She stood in the hot dark with her hand flat on the trench wall, feeling the fire breathe on the other side of the brick, and made the coldest entry of her year. The deed has waited 40 years under the fire. It can wait 5 more weeks. Fruit first, then the bricks. The cutting of the first pine was done on the 18th of December, at first light, with the frost thick on the outside of the mended glass, and the whole small nation of the acre assembled. Caleb, Ned, and Honora, and nobody spoke, because Amos Farabee had raised that plant from a sucker when the king was still sane, and the knife was his knife. She cut it with 6 inches of stalk, and its crown proud and perfect, and the scent came up out of the wound, rum and honey and something no English fruit has any business knowing, and Ned, who was 11 and had carried water for this thing through 9 months and a frozen summer, burst into tears and was not mocked. 8 fruit went to Sandgate on the 21st, packed as the book prescribed, each in its own straw nest in a hamper, cut that morning, and Honora rode with the Earl's wagon herself, because 10 guinea fruit does not travel unattended. At the great house she was received not at the kitchen door, but in the steward's room, which is a nation's diplomacy in miniature, and paid in coin across a baize table, 80 guineas counted twice, and the Earl's steward, a grave man who had bought fruit for that table for 30 years, looked at the 8 crowned heads ranged in their straw like a coronation and said, "I bought from Farabee of Wychmere when I was an under-butler, madam, and I never thought to see the like out of that glass again, and I am glad to have lived wrong." The London consignment went up to Peak and Son the same week. The remaining fruit of the first crop, 7 pines by the fast night coach, insured, and the settling letter came back before the new year with a banker's draft and 1 line from old Peak the elder. First of her fruit sold within the hour to a table I may not name, the strain holds. Ferriby's Kent is not dead. Tell your parish that. All told, the pines of that first Christmas, with the forced roots and the winter salads and the last of the orange crop behind them, brought the acres first year to 240 £1.09, shillings clear of every wage and every bill. And Honora Swan, who had begun the year with £140 and a parish's laughter, ruled the year's line under the sum as he had taught her. Once, in ink, no flourish. Then came January, and the queue. It began with the Sandgate party itself, for the guests whose rank the steward had only implied had eaten her fruit on Christmas Eve and asked, as such guests can, where in a famine year such a thing was grown. And the answer, a woman, alone, in a village glasshouse in Kent, was better than the fruit. Within a fortnight the acre had become the thing every great kitchen within a day's drive had to have and could not order in time, and they came down the lane in person, stewards, cooks, gentlemen's gentlemen, and then the gentry themselves, carriages standing on the frozen ruts outside the oak paling, while their owners waited their turn at a plank table by the stove-shed door, because Honora would not let buyers walk the ranks and chill the house, and what she had to sell she sold in strict rotation, first come, first served, a marchioness's man behind a Maidstone innkeeper, and no reordering for rank. The parish came out in the cold to watch the carriages queue. It was the best entertainment Wickmere had been offered in living memory. The spectacle of quality standing in the snow with silver in hand at the gate of the glass beggar's ruin, and the watchers included, on the 3rd Saturday of January, a face Honora saw through the glass and could not at first place, because she had never once seen it at rest before. It was her aunt, standing across the lane, not in the queue, just watching, with her hands folded and her chin up, wearing the expression of a woman at the front of a church, presiding, being, visibly, and for the benefit of every neighbor in the lane, the aunt. Lady Farrow held out until February and then lost to her own cook, which is how such fortresses usually fall. Pellingcourt was to entertain the county at Candlemas. The county in a hungry year expected a table that denied the year, and there was exactly 1 gate in 40 miles where such a denial could be purchased. The first approach came through a footman and was declined, not from spite but from arithmetic, the forcing pit's whole February crop being promised ahead. The second approach was Lady Farrow's own carriage in the lane, and her ladyship's own voice at the plank table come to inquire, with the sugared terribleness of her kind, whether an exception might be found for a neighbor. Honora came out to her, wiping her hands on her apron, and the two of them looked at each other across the plank, the woman who had ruled the parish's opinion for 30 years, and the girl that opinion had been used on, and Honora said, "For a neighbor, ma'am, I will do what I do for my neighbors, which is to put your name in the book in its turn. Mrs. quested at the tan yard is before you, and the George is before her. You will have your asparagus the 2nd week of February, at the book's price, and I will choose you the best of it myself, because Pellingcourt taught me young how much the look of a thing matters." Lady Farrow studied her for a long moment, with the lane watching, and whatever passed behind that seasoned face never reached it, but she inclined her head the depth of one card acknowledging another, and said, "The 2nd week of February will do very well, Miss Swan, and my compliments on your house. It is the only warm thing I have seen since June," and swept back to her carriage, having paid, in her own currency and in public, the only tribute that mattered, the rate. The rate, the turn, and the book. That same week, the trench book took a new kind of entry. The first letter from a stranger asking not for fruit, but for knowledge. A rector's widow in Sussex with a lean glebe and a dead vinery, asking how a woman alone might begin, and what it cost, and whether it were respectable. And Honora sat up past midnight, answering it fully. Prices and all, because somewhere in Hackney a nurseryman had once answered a plainly written letter from nobody, and she knew now what such an answer was worth. She could not know she would write hundreds like it before she was done, that the answering would in time be a work as large as the growing. That letter was the first, and the book records it as it recorded the first swallow, without comment, seen and set down. Through all of it, all that triumphant frozen January, two shadows kept their place at the edge of the light. The first was the assizes, drawing on toward March, the estate's claim standing unwithdrawn. Because Locksley, whatever his own heart had begun to argue, was bound in duty and in law to his creditors' trustees, who read the London attorney's opinion and saw a valuable improved acre recoverable at a jury's word, and would not hear of abandoning it on sentiment, and Dodd fed their resolve by every post, for reasons that had 2 years of unwatched timber behind them. And the second shadow lay under the south trench fire, 5 weeks nearer now. The parchment that would end it all, or the empty socket in the brick that would end it all the other way, and there were nights that January, standing in the hot aisle with the Q's silver locked in the iron box and the whole warm engine breathing round her, when Honora put her palm flat on the trench wall and asked the fire the question Amos used to ask his rosemary, and got the same answer he got, which was patience. In a warm silence, twice a day, forever. The Q itself furnished the parish with 2 scenes that January which entered its permanent repertory, told at the forge for years with improvements. The first was the affair of the Duchess's man, a personage in a many-caped traveling coat who arrived on the coldest Tuesday of the month, announced the name of his mistress to the plank table as other men announce artillery, and proposed to be served at once, there being before him in the line at that moment a Maidstone innkeeper's pot-boy, 2 cooks, and Mrs. Quested of the tan-yard with her basket. Honora's aunt, who kept the table on Tuesdays and had waited 30 years for such a moment without knowing it, looked up at the personage over her spectacles and said, in the voice of a corn factor's widow who has smelled every light shilling in Kent, "Sir, this house sells by the book, and the book knows no duchesses, only turns, and your turn stands 6th, and the fruit is not going anywhere, being unlike gentlemen's patience in that regard." The personage appealed, over her head, to the mistress of the ground, who came out wiping her hands, heard him through, and said only, "My aunt has stated the whole of our law, sir, but you have come far, and the wind is cruel. So you shall have what the book allows, which is a stool by the stove-shed fire while you wait your 6 turns." And the personage, measuring the alternatives, took the stool, and thawed, and was served 6th, and went away, it must be recorded, with the best pine of the day and a story he was heard retelling at his mistress's own table, where it did the acre more good than any obedience could have. The second scene nobody at the forge ever improved, because it needed nothing. On the last Saturday of the month, with snow coming down soft and the Q standing patient under the wall, a familiar gray horse came down the lane, and Mr. Quentin Locksley dismounted, and instead of coming to the gate as a neighbor with standing, walked to the end of the line and stood in it, in the snow, behind Ned's mother with her hampers, and waited his turn like a Christian, 3/4 of an hour. And when he reached the plank table at last, he bought, not pines, but the whole day's stock of oranges, every fruit of the 12 old trees then ripe, paid the book's price to the shilling, and gave his instruction quietly, though not so quietly the Q missed it, which he had perhaps not entirely intended. To go to the vicar, the lot, for the sick lists, with no name attached. Mrs. Harriard had the name out of the vicar before supper, as anyone but the vicar could have foretold, and the parish chewed it all week, and Lady Farrow, hearing it at cards, laid down her hand and said nothing at all, which those who knew her called the loudest thing she had said in a decade. And Honora entered the sale in the book as the book required, so many dozen at so much, sold to Q. L, delivered to the parish, and then sat looking at the entry a while with the pen in her hand, and added nothing to it, because the book had taught her that some accounts are truest left unglossed, and because she found, examining the matter, that she did not trust her own margins on the subject of that particular customer, a discovery she also declined to write down, though it kept her company through the locking up, and stood beside her while she banked the fires, and followed her all the way up the frozen lane home. The last pine of the winter crop was cut the first week of February, and sold at the gate to the steward of a house she never learned the name of. And that evening she drew the fires of the South Trench for the first time in 10 months, 3 days to cool. The lifted plants stood ranked in the north house in emergency beds of hot dung and leaves, grumbling but alive. On the morning of the 9th of February in the year 1817, Caleb Nutley took a mason's chisel, counted 9 courses up from the footing of the South Trench with his thumb, found the second bond stone from the stokehole, looked at his mistress once, and began, very gently, to open Amos Faraby's strong room. The bond stone came out whole, and behind it, in a chamber corbelled into the thickness of the wall no bigger than a bread oven, dry as August and warm as a hand, lay a box of rolled leads soldered at the seams, black with 40 years of gentle fire. Caleb carried it to the potting bench as if it were a christening child, and stood back, and took Ned out with him, and shut the door, because some openings belong to one pair of hands. She cut the solder with the pruning knife and unrolled the lead, and there it was. Parchment, supple and clean, the ink hardly browned. This indenture, made the 4th day of May in the 9th year of the reign of King George III, between Everard Locksley the elder, Esquire, of Wychmere Hall, of the one part, and Amos Faraby of the same parish, gardener, of the other part, witnesseth that in consideration of the sum of 35 pounds of lawful money, and of long and faithful service, the said Everard Locksley hath granted, bargained, sold, and confirmed unto the said Amos Faraby 1 acre of land at the south of the kitchen ground, with the glasshouses, walls, and sheds thereon standing, to have and to hold to the said Amos Faraby his heirs and assigns forever. Signed, sealed, delivered, 2 witnesses, an attorney of Maidstone long dead, and the hall's butler of that day longer dead still. Livery of Season endorsed on the back that the old squire's father had walked the acre with Amos and put a sod of it into his hand before the witnesses. Turf and twig, in the ancient manner, the ceremony that even a suspicious jury of freeholders would know in their bones, and with the deed folded small, a receipt for the 35 pounds, and a letter. The letter was not the deed's age. The hand was old Everard's, the drunken squire's, the ink not 20 years dry, and it was short. Amos, you asked me for the 3rd time to have the enrollment searched, and I have again done nothing. And you are right that my nephew's men, when I am gone, will eat you if they can, for the estate will owe more than it owns, and hungry lawyers respect nothing but parchment. So I set my hand here once more for whatever weight it carries. My father sold you the South Acre in May 1769. I saw the sod put in your hand myself, being then a boy of 12, and every apricot I have eaten these 50 years has come to me from ground that was none of mine. Keep the deed dry and the fire gentle, old friend. There is more of my father in your trenches than in my hall. Beneath the deed and the letter and the receipt lay the last thing, a packet of oiled paper tied in tarred twine, and on it, in the round, careful hand she knew better than her own, for Norrie, the rest of it. Inside were letters, years of letters, in a hand she had not seen for 11 years, a strong, slanted, sea-going hand that stopped her breath in her body, her father's. Nathaniel Swan to Amos Ferriby, from Gibraltar, from Malta, from English Harbor, from the Fever Coast, 20 years of friendship folded flat, and she read them through the whole of that day and let the trench stand open. And the letters gave her back her father not as memory gives, blurred and kind, but sharp and alive and laughing at his own jokes, sending seed and asking after Susanna's rosemary. And in the very last of them, written off Ushant 6 days before the arrow went down, was the sentence Amos Ferriby had built a strong room to keep. If the sea should have me at last, old friend, look sometimes at my Norrie, she has her mother's wits and my weather eye, and none of them will ever see it, because she is a girl and poor. But you and I have raised enough seedlings to know that the strain tells in the end, whatever ground it falls on. The strain tells in the end. She sat in the cooling glasshouse with her father's letter in one hand and the deed of her acre in the other. And outside the light went, and Caleb, who had waited in the stove shed 4 hours without once opening the door, finally opened it and found her asleep at the bench with her head on the oiled paper, and covered her with his own coat, and mended the fire, and said nothing to anybody ever, which was Caleb entire. Mr. Crump. When the lead box was set before him in Maidstone 2 days later, went through its contents with the terrible slowness of a man determined not to hope faster than the evidence, and then removed his spectacles, polished them, replaced them, and said, Miss Swan, in 40 years of practice I have seen 3 cases end on the production of a single instrument. This will be the 4th. A fee-offment with livery endorsed, a consideration receipted, and a confirmatory letter in the successor's own hand. There is no jury in Kent that deliberates 10 minutes on this, and no attorney in London who lets it reach one. And he wrote that same afternoon to the estate's solicitors, enclosing attested copies, and the answer that mattered came not from London, but on horseback. The following morning, one rider, alone, no steward. She received Locksley in the glasshouse, because it was hers and it was warm, and she set the deed on the bench and stood away from it and let him read, and he read it through twice, and then the old squire's letter, and at the letter his face, which had held steady through the parchment, stopped holding. He put it down with great care, and was quiet a while, and then said, I saw apricots on his table every summer I visited as a boy, and never once asked whose ground grew them, and there is the whole of it, is it not? We none of us ever asked. He looked down the ranks of glass toward the pines. Miss Swan, the claim is withdrawn this week, with the trustees' consent or over their objection, on my sole instruction and at my sole charge. That is not generosity, it is the end of an error, and you have my apology at last in the open, where Mr. Dodd once told you we should see what was yours. We have seen. I was wrong about this ground, and wrong about you, and of the 2 errors the second sits heavier. For the first was ignorance, but the second I had witnesses to correct me. A mended flew, and a night of hail among them, and I was slow. He stopped, and then finished it as a man empties his pockets. It is the best managed ground in this county, and its mistress has taught me more of stewardship in 10 months than my own steward has told me in 18, and on that head I have letters to write. For I have been reading 2 years of books that do not add, and I find the wool and the timber went where the acre nearly went, into the keeping of a man who trusted that nobody would ever count. Mr. Walter Dodd did not stand trial. For the sums, once the timber merchant's ledgers were compared against the estates, were made good by his sureties to the last shilling, and prosecution would have cost the trustees more than it returned, which Dodd had reckoned on, being a man who did all his stealing inside other men's arithmetic. But he was put out of his stewardship in one morning, without a character, in a county where every land agent from Rochester to Rye shortly knew why, and he removed to Southwark, where he found employment inspecting hides at a tannery wharf, a post in which it was observed at the Wickmere Forge with satisfaction too general to be unchristian. He was paid by the piece and watched by 2 clerks. The assize list for March, when it was published in the Kentish Gazette, carried no cause concerning any acre at Wickmere, and the Gazette, which had promised its readers a spectacle, consoled them with a paragraph instead, and the paragraph, read aloud at the forge, in the tap-room of the George, and in 14 parlors including Pelling Courts, said this: "We understand that the question lately stirred respecting the title of Miss Swan to the celebrated Glasshouse ground at Wickmere has been concluded without trial, a deed of conveyance of ancient date having been discovered, upon which the estate's claim was at once and honorably withdrawn. The fruit of this lady's houses, our readers will not need telling, has this hard winter been the wonder of the county, and it appears the ground was as sound as the produce, which those who laughed loudest in the spring may now reflect upon at leisure." Her aunt brought the paper to the acre herself, walking fast, and read the paragraph aloud standing among the pines, with her bonnet ribbons still swinging. And when she had done, she folded the paper along its creases with shaking hands and said, "They may now reflect upon it at leisure." And then, in a voice nobody in 11 years had heard her use, "Well, Norrie? Well, your mother would have understood all this before I did. I have been the longest lesson in your book, I think, but I am learned now, and I should like, if you will have me on Thursdays to keep the Q's accounts at the plank table. For I was a corn factor's wife, and I can smell a light shilling through a glove, and it is time the family was of some use to you, having been so long only a weight." And Honora, who had taken an earl's 80 guineas without her eyes stinging, took her aunt's Thursdays, and found she could not answer for a moment, and did not need to, for her aunt had already sat down at the bench and begun ruling a cash page, briskly, as if 40 years of fright had been a coat she had finally been allowed to take off. The south trench was rebuilt in April, better than before, for she had Amos's plans and a mason's full fortnight, and into the new 9th course. At Caleb's grave suggestion, they mortared a penny of the year 1817, so the wall should keep a secret again, he said, only a cheaper one. And Ned laughed, and Honora found she could laugh too, in that house, at that wall, which told her something about the year that all the sums did not. The stock came back into the warm bed on May Day, and the acre stood whole, proved, and hers. Freehold in law, as it had long been freehold in fact, and the strangest season of her life began, the season of being right in public, which is a weather all its own and wants as much managing as frost. The letters were the first sign of it. The rector's widow in Sussex had been answered in January, and had told a cousin and the cousin a school friend, and by June the carrier was bringing 4 and 5 letters a week, from widows with glebe land and half-pay officers' wives, and a mill owner's daughter in the north, all asking the same questions under different hands. How did you begin? What did it cost, dare I? She answered them all, at the plank table in the evenings, at the book's own standard, figures and no flattery. Begin with salads and small glass, buy fuel when your neighbors are warm, keep one book and keep it honestly, expect 3 years of laughter. And she kept copies, and the copies grew into a ledger of their own, which her aunt ruled and indexed on Thursdays and called, with a corn factor's accuracy, the seed correspondence. "For," she said, "it is stock going out to other ground, Norrie, and stock comes back. Wait and see." Then came the letter with the London seal, from the Horticultural Society itself, to whom Amos Ferriby had written measurements for 30 years, and who had learned from Peake the younger where the old man's book and strain had gone. They wrote to Miss Swan with grave courtesy, as to the keeper of a correspondent's papers, and asked whether the observations of the late Mr. Ferriby on the winter management of the pine stove, particularly through the singular season of 1816, might be communicated to the society, and Honora spent 3 weeks of evenings composing the paper. His data and her year, the crossed signs, the bought fuel, the June frost and the full open fires, the temperatures at every station of that killing night, and she signed it as the truth required. From the trench book of Amos Ferriby, gardener, 55 years, prepared and continued by Honora Swan, his pupil. It was read at a meeting in London that autumn by the secretary, as papers from the country were read, and the minutes record that the fellows present desired their particular thanks to be conveyed for the completest account of stove culture in a calamitous season yet laid before them, and a silver medal was voted, to the trench book's account as it were, and came down to Wickmere in a box lined with velvet, and Caleb, shown it at the bench, turned it over twice in his great hand, read the engraving at his own pace, and gave his verdict, "It is a fine thing, miss." And the old one would have asked what it weighed, and then hung it on a nail in the shed, which is where, in the event, it hung. The open day was her aunt's idea, which surprised the parish, and was meant to, for Mrs. Pratt had views about how a vindication should be conducted, and they were the views of a woman who had sat at Pellingcourt's card table for 30 years being genteelly poor, and they amounted to this, that a triumph hoarded is a triumph halved, and the parish that had laughed must be let in at the gate to see, freely, with their own eyes, or the laughter would only go underground and sour. So on the first Saturday of August in the year 1817, the acre at Wickmere stood open from noon to 7, every soul in the parish welcome, the fires banked low, the walks swept. The first fruits of the summer crop laid out on trestles under the orange trees, and a barrel of quested small beer at the gate, and they came, all of them, the forge and the shop and the church and the court, near 400 people through one oak gate in an afternoon, walking the warm aisles in their Sunday clothes, with their voices dropping at the door as if the glass were a nave. They stood before the pines the longest, as people always did, the savage crowned things from the other side of the world growing out of a Kentish trench, and parents held children up to smell the ripe one, and old men who had known Amos stood at the rebuilt south wall and put their palms flat on the brick to feel the low breath of the fire, and said to each other, "Warm, do you feel it? Warm as a beast," and did not always say whom they were remembering, and did not need to. By the rosemary bush at the stove shed door, which had been clipped and dressed for the day like a relative brought to a wedding, stood the plank table, and on the table, open, under Ned's guard, lay the trench book itself, turned to the 12th of June, 1816, so that anyone who could read might read what had been done in that house on the night the parish froze. And a queue formed at the book that did not shorten all afternoon, and Mr. Harryard the vicar stood at it twice. The concessions came all afternoon, in the come and go, in parish coin, a nod here, a doffed hat there. Mrs. Harryard saying to the doctor's wife, in the hearing she intended, that she had said from the first there was more in that girl than the parish allowed, which was not true, and was forgiven. For recanting is a duty, and nobody performs it gracefully. Old Mr. Crake the miller walked the aisles twice with his hat off, and paid his tribute in miller's coin, telling everyone at the beer barrel exactly what the workhouse frames had put into the hungry gap that spring, and exactly what they had shaved from the poor rate at the Easter vestry to the shilling, and finishing every recitation with the same verdict. And I called her cracked, mind, at the vestry. In the spring of the year 16, I ask you. The doctor's wife, who had laughed at the Pellingcourt card table on a certain evening in the April of 1816, brought her a cutting of her own white jasmine, wrapped in wet flannel, and said, holding it out, I was one of them that laughed. Miss Swan, I won't pretend otherwise. You were there and heard me. Plant this somewhere it can hear the fires, and when it flowers, that is me, saying it every summer. And late in the day, when the light was going long and gold down the aisles, Lady Adeline Farrow came, last, as was her right and her art, and walked the whole house on Honora's arm, slowly, missing nothing, and stopped at the end of the pine ranks and delivered, before witnesses of her own careful choosing, the sentence she had composed for the occasion, which was, in its way, the greatest concession of the age. Miss Swan, she said, I called this place a beggar's glass, in my own drawing room, where I have been wrong before, but never so thoroughly. I have spent 30 years teaching this parish what to think, and you have spent 18 months teaching it to look instead, and looking has the better of it, and there is my hand. And at Pellingcourt, from this day, whatever is said of you is said to my face, which I assure you is a form of insurance no money buys in this county. Honora took the hand, which was the first time in her life she had touched Lady Farrow otherwise than in a curtsy, and found she had no speech ready, and gave instead the thing that had been growing in her all that golden afternoon, standing in Amos Ferriby's house among Amos Ferriby's neighbors with her father's letters not 30 feet away in the iron box. Ma'am, she said, I have learned only one thing worth teaching, and it is this. Ground never asks what you were. It answers what you tend. He knew it, and he tended me, and this is what came up. Lady Farrow looked at her for a moment with an expression her card table would not have recognized, and said quietly, Yes. Well, and looked away down the burning gold of the aisle, and pressed the hand she held once, hard, before she let it go. And that was all, and it was everything. Of Silas Ferriby the day had one small word, and the year no more. He had taken what was left of the £50 when the lawyers were done with him and found a stool in a Faversham malt-house, where he kept tallies and spoke often, it was reported by the maltster's men, of his uncle, the famous one, the gardener, in the tone of a man spending a coin he had been given and had never earned, and Wickmere, hearing it, judged him at the forge in one sentence, delivered by the smith, He has him for a boast now that he wouldn't have for a burden. And there the parish let him lie. One person was absent from the open day whom the lane had confidently expected, and his absence was studied by every matron present and reported to those bedridden or out of reach the same evening. Mr. Quentin Locksley did not come, and the reason arrived the following Tuesday, on the grey horse, in the person of the man himself, who found her staking the young pines and asked if he might speak to her at the gate, and stood there turning his hat in his hands in a manner the whole county would have paid to see, and said, "I stayed away Saturday on purpose, and I owe you the reason. If I had come, the parish would have watched us and not the glass, and Saturday belonged to the glass, and to him. But I am here now, on my own errand, and it is this. I have watched you for 18 months. I began as your adversary, I continued as your debtor, and I have ended as your pupil, and none of those is what I wish to be. I will not make you speeches. You would enter them in that book of yours under weather. I ask leave to court you, Miss Swan, openly, at your gate, in the parish's full view, and at whatever pace you set, and if the answer is no, I will ride home and remain, I hope, the neighbor you send for on bad nights." And Honora Swan, freeholder, stood with her hands full of bast and looked at him, the man who had blistered his palms on her flue rods and stood on her ladders in the hail, and withdrawn a winning suit at his own charge because a dead squire's letter shamed him into arithmetic his lawyers called folly. And she said, "You may court me, Mr. Locksley, at the pace of the seasons, which is the only pace I trust, and you should know what you are courting. A woman with an acre that is not for merging, a book that is not for closing, and a trade that is not for dropping, and if that is a scandal, the county must season itself to it." He smiled then, the whole soldier's face opening, and said, "Madam, I have seen your terms across a plank table before. I know better than to haggle," and rode off down the lane, sitting his horse like a man who has carried a position, and behind her in the Glasshouse Caleb Nutley, who had heard every word through 4 open lights and would deny it to his grave, began, tunelessly, and for the first time in living memory, to whistle. The courtship was conducted, as promised, at the pace of the seasons, and the parish offered a spectacle, got instead an education, which disappointed the matrons and fascinated everyone else. He came on Saturdays, as she had once gone to Amos, and he came to work. The county's second-best gossip, after the courtship itself, was the sight of the master of Witchmere Hall in a fustian jacket, learning to graft, to plunge pots, to read a bark bed with the flat of his hand, taking his orders like Ned and his dinner at the plank table like everyone, and what the parish could not see, and what mattered more was the other lesson running underneath, for between the grafting and the dinner they talked, hour on hour, week on week, of the 2 properties, and the talk was the courtship. The hall was coming back by inches. With Dodd gone, the books came clean, and with the books clean, the estate's true state stood plain. Poor but honest, mortgaged deep but not drowned. And Locksley, an engineer by training and a walker of his own ground by new conviction, had begun the long sap work of recovery. Leases renegotiated face to face, the home farm put to turnips and hardy sheep on the new system, the park's timber thinned by plan instead of by theft. It was Honora's counsel, asked and given across the potting bench, that turned the kitchen quarter, the hall's 4 acres of walled garden standing derelict, from a humiliation into an engine. Glass mended a house a year, out of income. Never debt, the book's rule, and the produce contracted ahead to the trade she now knew by name from Maidstone to town, until the ground that had shamed 3 generations began, shilling by shilling, to carry its own wall repairs and then some. She would not manage it for him, and told him why in the book's language 2 grounds, 2 books, or neither is ever honest. But she trained the man he hired, a silent Scot named Alistair Rennie, who had been under gardener at a great place in Perthshire and wanted a kingdom of his own, and Rennie proved sound, and the two gardens settled into the neighborly rivalry of separate kingdoms, trading suckers and bark and weather warnings over the park wall, which was, Caleb observed, how it had been in the very old days, when he was a boy, and the world had more sense. The proposal, when its season came in December, in the orangery in the evening, a year almost to the day from the cutting of the first pine. He had asked her to walk the house with him after the fires were made up, and at the south end, by the rebuilt trench with the penny in its 9th course, he stopped, and she saw that the hat was in the hands again, and stood still, and let him come to it in order like a man reporting an engineering survey, which is precisely what he then did. He had, he said, spent the autumn with Mr. Crump, at his own charge, having a settlement drawn, and he wished her to hear its terms before any other word was said, because the terms were the proposal, and the rest was only asking. The acre, the glass houses, the stock, the book, and every shilling the trade earned, now or ever, to be settled to her separate use, hers alone, beyond the reach of husband's creditors, and husband's heirs, held by trustees of her naming, and he had taken the liberty of suggesting. As trustees, Mr. Crump and Mr. Barnabas Peake the younger, subject entire to her judgment, her earnings hers, her ground hers, her name on her own gate as long as she chose, and a clause, which Mr. Crump had told him was irregular, and which he had required anyway, that the trench book itself should pass at her death, wherever she alone should will it, being, the clause said, in words he had dictated himself, an inheritance of knowledge, of which the law of property knows too little. Then he put the papers on the bench, weighted them against the drought with a pruning knife that had been Amos Faraby's, and said, I do not come to gather you in, Honora. I come asking to be let in. I have seen what this ground does with what is given it, and I am asking to be planted. That is the whole of my speech, and the terms are on the bench, and the answer is yours. And whichever it is, the fires in this house will never want fuel while I live within reach of them. She looked at the papers, and at the man, and out through the dark glass to where 2 winters ago there had been only frost and a parish laughing, and she found that the answer had been ready a long while, laid up dry and waiting like everything else of value in that wall, and she said, in the low, steady voice she kept for entries that mattered, the terms are accepted. Quentin, and so is the man. And then, because she was her father's daughter, and the room was very warm, and his face was doing what it had done at the old squire's letter, she added, and you may tell Mr. Crump the trustees will do very well, and that the first business of the trust will be a wedding gift from me to you, 40 melon lights for your kitchen quarter, at cost, which is the most romantic sentence ever spoken in this house. And he laughed out loud, alone in the warm dark among the sleeping trees, and took her hands, both of them, work rough as his own now, and held them, and outside the glass, very softly, in the sort of timing the parish would never have believed and the trench book would simply have recorded, it began to snow. They published the banns at Wickmere Church on 3 January Sundays, Mr. Harryard reading them with a satisfaction he did not attempt to disguise, and the parish, which had rehearsed its scandal for a year, found, to its bewilderment, that there was none to be had. The settlement did the impossible thing. It silenced the drawing rooms, for the marriage could not be called mercenary in either direction, he gaining no acre, she gaining no rescue, and Lady Farrow, applied to for the county's ruling in the matter, delivered it over cards at Pelling Court, with the new insurance in full force. They are the only couple of my acquaintance, she said, marrying with their eyes open and their books balanced, and whoever finds fault with that may explain their own accounts to me first. And the table, which included two ladies who had laughed in the April of 1816 and remembered it every day since, found no takers, and the matter was ruled. Word of the wedding travelled further than the parish, in the seed correspondence, outward on the carrier, in her own answers, inward from strangers who had somehow heard, and one letter came up from Faversham in a hand she knew from 12 pressed copies in the back of the book, and she opened it standing, and it was short, and it had cost its writer something. "Miss Swan," it said, "I hear you are to be married, and I write to say a thing I said badly once at your gate. I went to law over the acre because I could not credit that he would pass over blood, and I have had a year of tallies and evenings to think in, and I credit it now. Blood asked him for money 12 times. You asked him for work. He chose what a gardener would choose, and I have stopped saying otherwise, in Faversham or anywhere. I ask nothing by this letter. I only did not want it said, when your banns were read, that his nephew was still speaking against the house. Wishing you the joy he would have wished you, Silas Ferriby." She read it twice, entered it in the book's manner, received this day from S.F. 1 letter, being the last debt of the estate paid, and answered it with a wedding invitation, which was not forgiveness in the parish's theatrical style, but was the book style, an account ruled and carried forward, and Silas came to the church door on the day, in his best coat, and stood at the back, and shook Caleb's hand in the churchyard, and went home to Faversham on the evening coach, and troubled that story never again. They were married in April, in the year 1818, on a morning that came up soft and blue, as if the sky had decided the debt of 1816 was paid. And the church was full past the doors, and the wedding breakfast was held where everyone had known it must be, in the orangery at trestles down the warm aisle between the pines and the orange trees, which stood in fullest flower for the occasion, so that 400 people ate ham and seed cake under a roof of white scent, and old men said there had been nothing like it since the old king's jubilee, and were not contradicted. Her aunt cried, at the church and again at the trestles, and gave up explaining that she was not crying, and gave the bride her own mother's lace, kept dry through every lean year in paper and lavender, and said, holding it out, "I had meant it for your wedding since you were 14, Norrie. Even in the years I behaved as if I hadn't." Ned, 13 now and grown out of 2 jackets, stood at the church in a collar that endangered his ears, and Caleb Nutley stood up in the front pew in his Sunday blacks, at the bride's own instruction, in the place a father would have stood, and when she came down the aisle on no man's arm, freeholder to the last, he was heard to clear his throat with a violence that shook the pew, and examined the roof beams of the church at length, and his opinion of the day, delivered that evening at the forge, entered the parish's permanent stock. "I have seen 50 springs come," he said, "and that is the first one I ever saw walk. If you would know how it all came out, come and stand in the lane at Wickmere on any June morning in the year 1820, and look through the oak gate that a steward once rattled, and see. 2 great glass houses now instead of 1. The second raised the summer after the wedding and named on a slate at its door the Ferriby House, in which 6 boys and, the county's freshest scandal and already wearing out, 2 girls are apprenticed to the trade, lodged and fed and taught their letters at night at the plank table. The first of them, the rector's widow's son from Sussex, sent up by his mother with a letter that began, "Madam, you answered me once when I was nobody, and now I send you my boy." The trenches breathing their old heat under new fruit, the pines in their ranks, Ferriby's Kent going up to town in season under Peak and Sons label with the name of its ground printed plain, Wickmere, grown under the Ferriby Trench, and in the seed correspondence now 3 ledgers thick. Letters from 11 counties and one, that spring, from Boston in the Americas, where a merchant's widow with a cold hillside had read the society's minutes and wanted the winter management explained across an ocean, and got it at the usual standard, figures and no flattery. The hall stands open again, on its rise, its kitchen quarter glassed and earning, its master half a farmer now and content, and on Sunday afternoons the two of them may be seen walking the park wall between the kingdoms, the master of the hall and the mistress of the acre, married 2 years and still trading over that wall like friendly nations. And if you followed them home past the stove shed, you would see the rosemary bush by the door grown broad as a chair, clipped every March by the mistress's own hand, and beside it now a white jasmine, thriving, planted where it can hear the fires. And on the potting bench, under the window where the light is best, the trench book lies open as it has lain open for 50 years and more. Its pages ruled ahead into a future its first keeper never doubted, and the entries go on in a woman's strong plain hand, bark and fires and sewings and sums, and among them on the June morning I am telling of, this, which is where we shall leave her, Ned's first melon cut this day, sound and sweet. He to have the price of it entire. Note, the strain tells in the end, whatever ground it falls on. She was 24 when a parish laughed at her inheritance, and 25 when the county queued at her gate in the snow, and all that ever stood between the one morning and the other was an acre everyone had written off, a book nobody had read, and a woman nobody had looked at, tending what she was given until it answered. If you have sat with me to the end of this fire, thank you, truly, for stories like Honora's are kept alive the way her Glasshouse was, by the few who keep coming back with coals. Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight, for this hearth has friends from Kent to Kansas, and I love to see the map fill. And tell me this, when the frost of your own 1816 came down on your life, and it comes for us all, what saved you, or what will? Write patience if you believe it was the long faithful work laid up before the storm like Amos's 50 years, or write courage if you believe it was the one cold-handed choice made in the middle of the night, like Honora opening the fires full, and read the answers of the others when you have written yours, for there is 50 years of weather in this congregation, and the book only grows when we all rule our lines in it. Next Sunday evening I shall have another story for you, of another woman the world priced too cheaply, and the strange bequest that proved the world wrong. So subscribe if you have not, and bring a friend who likes a slow fire. Somewhere in Kent this evening a glasshouse is going dark, the last lantern moving down the long aisle past the orange trees, a woman's shadow pausing at the south wall to lay one palm flat against the warm brick, the snow beginning again, soft on the roof of glass, and inside, in the dark, the green things breathing, and the fire, banked and gentle, keeping